The bread was burning. Mira noticed it the way she noticed most things in her father's hall, a few seconds too late to prevent it, just in time to deal with the aftermath. She yanked the pan from the iron hook above the hearth, the smell of scorched crust filling the kitchen corridor in a thick, nutty wave. Cook would have her head. Cook always had her head. And Mira would apologize, and Cook would grumble, and the bread would be trimmed of its blackened edges and placed on the Lord's table anyway because Lord Aldrich Voss of the Northern Reach did not waste food. He wasted daughters, but not food. She set the pan on the stone counter and pressed her flour-dusted palms flat against the cool surface, letting the ache drain from her fingers. It was early still. The hall hadn't fully woken. She could hear the distant clank of the stable boys bringing water, the low argument of two hounds over something in the courtyard, the creak of floorboards overhead where her elder sister Petra slept in the room with the good window, the sounds of an ordinary morning, safe sounds, the kind that asked nothing of her. She should have known better than to trust them. The hall doors opened, not the kitchen side door, which was hers, which smelled of yeast and wood smoke and the lavender she tucked between the rafters to keep the flies away. The main doors, the great iron-banded ones that hadn't moved since her father's last hunting party, 6 months ago. They groaned like something injured, and then the smell hit her, sharp and cold, and layered the way deep water smells when you stand at the edge, clean and dangerous all at once. And every wolf instinct she possessed snapped straight like a struck bell. Alpha. Not her father's alpha musk, which she'd lived under all her life, a familiar weight that pressed rather than commanded. This was different, older, more absolute. It filled the corridor from 30 feet away, slid under the kitchen door and wrapped around her lungs, and her wolf sat up inside her chest and made a sound she had never heard from it before. Interested, afraid, something in between. She pressed her back against the counter. Through the kitchen door she heard her father's footsteps, fast, purposeful, the stride he used when receiving guests he wanted to impress, and hated that he wanted to. She heard Petra's door slam open upstairs, the rapid padding of bare feet on stone. Everyone was moving. Everyone was antspling toward those main doors like iron filings toward a lodestone. She stayed in the kitchen with her burnt bread and her flour-covered hands, and she listened. Alpha King, her father's voice, smooth as rendered fat. We are honored. A pause. 1 beat. 2. The kind of silence a man uses when he is deciding how little to say. Voss. The voice that answered was low and even, and seemed to arrive through the stone floor as much as through the air. I'll keep this brief. Her father murmured something. An invitation. Wine. A seat. The good fire in the eastern room. She knew the script. She'd been watching her father perform it since she was small enough to hide behind the tapestry in the great hall and go unnoticed. I've come for your daughter, the Alpha King said. Mira's hands went still on the pan. Petra would be your other daughter. She heard it. The silence that followed was different from the first one. This one had edges. Her father's voice, when it came again, was careful in a way that told her everything. Mira. Not a question. A calculation, already running. Draw up the papers, the Alpha King said. I want the wedding by nightfall. Her name was Mira Voss, and she had 22 years of practice at understanding exactly where she ranked in a room. It wasn't self-pity. She'd long since moved past that narrow corridor and come out the other side into something cleaner, something closer to clear-eyed acceptance. She was the second daughter, the quiet one, the one who had her mother's broad hands and her grandmother's stubborn jaw and none of Petra's gilt-edged shimmer. She could track a deer through frost and read weather in cloud formations and brew a fever tincture that would drop your temperature inside an hour. These were not, her father had explained to her once with the patient weariness of a man stating an obvious fact, the skills that made an advantageous match. Petra was the advantageous match. Petra was tall and fair and laughed like silver water over stone, and she had once made the son of the Eastern Reach Pack's lord forget his own name by simply entering a room. Petra was the plan. Mira was the backup plan's backup plan. The daughter you married off quietly, eventually, to someone useful if not distinguished. She had accepted this the way she accepted the burned bread. A few seconds of regret, then the trim and the table anyway, but not this. She heard her father's footsteps approaching the kitchen door, and she turned back to the bread, because it was the only sensible thing to do with her hands. The door opened. Lord Aldrich Voss filled the frame, a tall man, heavy through the chest, with the close-cropped silver beard he oiled every morning, and the deep-set eyes that had always made her feel like a number he was still calculating. "You heard," he said. Most of the hall heard. "Then you understand what this is." He stepped inside, closed the door behind him. Quietly. That small deliberateness was worse than shouting would have been. "This is Calder Vane doing what he does, making a point, at my expense." Calder Vane. The Alpha King's full name settled into the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. She had never met him. She knew the same things everyone knew, that he had taken the kingship at 24 after his father's death, that he had ended 3 border conflicts in 5 years through methods that no one fully explained but everyone respected, that he had never taken a mate, that his advisor, a man named Soren Ashvale, was the most feared political mind in the 7-pack territories, that the Alpha King himself was said to be made of something colder than ordinary men. She also knew, and this she had learned the way you learn things in a lord's hall, through corners and thin walls and conversations meant for other ears, that her father had betrayed Calder Vane's trust 2 years ago. A land agreement. A lie within it. The kind of wound that didn't close on its own. She turned to look at her father. "He wants me as a punishment." "He wants you as an insult." Aldrich's voice was flat. "A bride chosen from the bottom of my house. A reminder to every territory that watches that Voss's second daughter, the one nobody wanted, is good enough for a political slight. No more." It should have stung. Perhaps another version of herself would have felt it keener. But there was something almost clarifying about being told the truth plainly, without the cushioning of euphemism, and she found she was more grateful for it than wounded. "What does he plan to do with me after?" she asked. "A marriage can be dissolved. He'll let it stand long enough to make the point." Her father's jaw worked. Something lived in that muscle. Not guilt. Never guilt with Aldrich Voss, but something adjacent to it. "You'll be housed at the royal palace, fed, kept in comfort, and eventually he'll find some reason to set you aside, and you'll come home, and we will all pretend it didn't happen." She looked at the bread. She thought about the kitchen, about the lavender in the rafters, about the hounds in the courtyard, and the ordinary morning that had been ordinary for approximately 30 minutes, and would not be ordinary again. She thought about her wolf, and what her wolf had done when that scent rolled under the door. "All right," she said. "You're not—" He stopped. "You're not going to argue. Would it change anything?" The calculation ran behind his eyes. "No." "Then I'll need an hour to pack." She set the bread pan aside and brushed the flour from her hands. "I assume he wants to do this in the hall. I'd rather not be seen looking like I've been baking." Her father stared at her with something that might, on a different man, have been the early ancestor of shame. She walked past him through the kitchen door and up the back stairs, and she kept her chin level, and she did not let herself think about what her wolf had said. Not yet. His name was Calder Vane, and he had been planning this for 2 years. He stood in Aldrich Voss's great hall, while Voss's steward brought wine he wouldn't drink, and the fire was stoked higher for his benefit, and he let the performance wash over him the way rain washes over stone. The hall smelled of old rushes and dog and the faintly sour undercurrent of a man's anxiety. He could read Voss's emotional state through the air itself, could have read it at 50 paces. The man was frightened and calculating and working very hard to look like neither. Good. That was the point. He studied the mounted antlers above the fireplace. One rack was missing a tine, snapped off at the base, clumsily repaired with dark wax that hadn't quite matched, the kind of thing a man overlooked in his own hall because he'd stopped seeing it. Calder filed it away without knowing why. He collected details out of reflex. His father had called it a useful habit, and his advisors called it unsettling, and both were probably right. "The girl is," Voss began. "She'll present herself when she's ready." Calder didn't look at him. "I'm not in a hurry." Soren Ashvale materialized at his left shoulder. He had a talent for that, appearing without having arrived. A skill Calder had spent years trying to identify, and had decided was simply a function of Soren's shoes, which made no sound on any surface. His advisor was a lean man with a scholar's stoop and a habit of pressing one finger against his bottom lip when he was thinking. He was pressing it now. "The contract is ready," Soren said quietly. "Witnessed and sealed. Your seal." "I know what my seal looks like." "Of course." A pause. "She's 22. No prior betrothals. Clean health record, good standing in the pack hierarchy, mid-rank, submissive on paper, but there's a note from the regional assessor. I don't need her dossier. The assessor's note says her wolf rank reads differently in person than on parchment," Soren continued, unbothered. He had learned, over 8 years of service, that Calder's interruptions were often invitations to keep talking. "Thought you should know." Calder finally looked at him. "What does that mean?" Soren's finger left his lip. "It means whoever assessed her wasn't paying close attention." Before Calder could process that, a door at the far end of the hall opened. Not the main doors, not the servants' entrance, but a narrow door set into the paneling that he hadn't catalogued yet, which bothered him. And she walked in. He knew her immediately. Not from any description, Soren's file had mentioned only the bare facts, but from his wolf, which did something in that moment that it had never, in 31 years of living with it, done before. It went still. Not the stillness of calm, not the stillness of waiting, a different kind. The stillness of a thing that has been moving for a very long time and has suddenly found what it was always moving toward. He did not let it show on his face. He was good at that. She walked the length of the hall with a flour-dusted smear on her left wrist that she hadn't fully cleaned off, and her dark hair braided back in a plain style that owed nothing to ceremony. She was shorter than Petra Voss. He'd registered Petra at the top of the stairs, gilt beautiful and watching with wide eyes. And she moved with a quality he couldn't name for a moment, then could, like someone who was used to being overlooked and had decided to use it. Her eyes were a clear, dark amber, the color of pine resin, and they found his face with a directness that his wolf noted and filed somewhere it intended to return to. She stopped at a respectful distance, not submissive, calibrated. "Alpha King," she said. Her voice was even. She did not bow the full deference bow her father was performing 3 feet away. "Mira Voss." He said her name like a test. "Yes," she said, like an answer. He made himself look away. Back to Voss. Back to the contract Soren was already unrolling. The mechanics of it. The point. He had planned this for 2 years and he would see it through. A slight returned for a betrayal. A bride chosen from the bottom of the house. Simple, elegant, lasting. The kind of message that didn't require armies. His wolf was less interested in the message. "Shall we proceed?" he said. And it wasn't a question. She had expected a ceremony. She had expected witnesses, vows spoken before the pack, the formal bond acknowledgement that was supposed to happen in front of an alpha elder to be properly registered. She had expected, in short, the performance of marriage even if the substance was hollow. What she got was a contract signed at a writing table in her father's hall, with Soren Ashvale and her father's steward as witnesses, and then the Alpha King's hand extended toward her, not reaching, waiting, offering the choice of contact or its absence. Her wolf surged. She took his hand. The touch lasted exactly as long as was needed to press palms together for the bond seal, an old formality, older than written contract, the kind of thing pack custom insisted on even for political matches. His hand was warm. His grip was controlled, the kind of pressure that knew exactly how much it was applying. His scent hit her at contact range like a change in weather. Rain-washed stone and something darker underneath, cedar resin or something close to it, and under that a note she didn't have a name for. A note her wolf identified instantly and kept. Hers. She heard his breath change, almost inaudible. If she had been anywhere else in the room, she wouldn't have caught it. But she was holding his hand, and she caught it, and she filed it away in the same place she was storing everything she was not going to look at directly until she was alone. He released her hand, stepped back, put 6 inches between them as if restoring something he'd let slip. "We leave at sundown," he said, to her or the room, she wasn't sure. "Travel light." "I already did," she said. He looked at her again, that measuring look. She'd been measured her entire life, and she knew the varieties. Dismissal. Dismissal dressed as consideration. Actual assessment. This was the third kind. She kept her expression neutral and let him look. "Good," he said, and he turned away. Her father caught her at the bottom of the stairs when she went to retrieve her bag, his hand on her arm. That grip she knew. Not cruel, just proprietary. The grip of a man who had always thought of his children as extensions of his own reputation. "Behave yourself," he said quietly. "Don't antagonize him. He has a long memory." "So I've heard, Mira." The grip tightened. "I know this isn't... It's all right," she said, and she meant it, which was the strange part, and she watched that confuse him as she gently freed her arm and went upstairs. It wasn't all right exactly, but it wasn't the disaster it should have been, and she was smart enough to know that the gap between those two things was worth paying attention to. She stood in her room one last time. The narrow bed, the good wool blanket she was taking, the shelf of remedy bottles she'd lined up by height like a small glass army. The pressed wildflowers in the frame her mother had made before she died. She took that too, wrapped in linen inside the bag. She looked at the room and let herself feel it. The weight of years. The shape of a life small enough to pack in one bag. Then she picked up the bag and went down to meet her husband. The carriage was finer than anything she'd ridden in. Lacquered black with silver fittings, the vane crest, a wolf mid-leap, mouth closed, which she'd always found interesting, on the door panels. The horses were gray-matched pairs, their breath steaming in the evening cold. The Alpha King rode alongside on a black horse that moved like dark water, never quite still, always on the edge of acceleration. He did not ride in the carriage with her. Soren Ashvale did. His advisor sat across from her with the quiet, settled presence of a man completely comfortable in small spaces, and he watched the passing dark through the window for the first part of the journey, as if cataloging the trees. He had the particular quality of stillness that meant he was thinking very fast. "You took it better than I expected," he said eventually. She considered several responses and chose the truthful one. "Better than my father, you mean?" "He'll be dining on humiliation for months." Soren's tone was not unkind, simply accurate. "That was the intention, in case you hadn't gathered." "I'd gathered." "Good." He pressed one finger against his lip. "Then you also understand that your position is unusual. Not unpleasant, I hope, but unusual. You'll have your own rooms, your own staff if you want them. His Majesty is not—" A pause. "He's not a cruel man, whatever you may have heard." She looked at him directly. "I didn't hear much about his character. I heard about his memory." "Yes." Soren's mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but related to one. "He does have that." Outside, the rhythm of the horses changed as the road improved. Through the window, the trees were thinning, showing sky. Deep blue going to purple. The first stars just beginning to hold their light. The carriage lanterns swung with the motion, throwing amber light in small shifting patches. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." Why me specifically? He could have made the same point with almost any choice. Petra would have been a worse insult. She's the prized one. Soren looked at her for a long moment. That finger left his lip. "I'm not certain I'm the right person to answer that question," he said carefully. "Then give me your best guess." "My best guess," he said, "is that his wolf had something to say about it." He returned his gaze to the window. Calder doesn't often listen to his wolf. When he does, it's usually significant. She sat with that for the rest of the journey. The carriage rocked and the lanterns swung, and outside, occasionally she caught the sound of the Alpha King's horse moving alongside them. A steady, grounding sound. That particular quality of hoofbeat that was neither in a hurry nor dawdling, simply keeping pace. She pressed her fingers against the cool glass of the window and did not let herself read too much into anything. She was good at that. The royal palace arrived the way important things sometimes did. First as a smell, wood smoke and stone and the mineral edge of river water. Then as sound, the distant murmur of a much larger human settlement, gates, activity. Then as light through the window, multiple fires against a stone wall that went up and up further than she'd expected. The scale of it. She had known intellectually that the Alpha King was a king. She had not translated that knowing into the physical fact of where he lived. The gates opened before they reached them. No call, no signal she detected. They simply opened, and the carriage moved through into a courtyard lit by torches set into iron brackets. And there were people here, servants and guards and a small assembly of what looked like senior staff or council members, and all of them were looking at the carriage door, looking at her. The footman opened the door. She stepped down onto the courtyard stone and she felt it. Not saw it, felt it, through the shift in the air and the almost inaudible intake of collective breath. These people knew what this marriage was. They'd been told, or they'd guessed, or they simply knew the politics well enough to read it themselves. She could see it in the way they looked at her. Not with cruelty, most of them, but with the careful neutrality of people trying to assess which way this would fall. She kept her chin level. She had 22 years of practice. She could do this in her sleep. The Alpha King dismounted and a groom took his horse, and he walked toward the assembly with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never had to announce his presence in a room because every room knew it before he entered. He spoke briefly with a tall woman who had the look of a head housekeeper, silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, a chatelaine of keys at her belt. And then he turned and looked at Mira. Across the width of the courtyard, 8, 10 feet of cold air between them. "Etta will show you to your rooms," he said. His voice carried without effort. "Supper will be sent up. If you need anything tonight, ask her." She held his gaze. "Thank you." Something crossed his face, too fast, too controlled. She caught the edge of it and lost the center. "Good night," he said, and walked through the inner doors without looking back. Etta appeared at her elbow. Up close, the housekeeper smelled of beeswax and chamomile, and was studying her with eyes that missed nothing and gave nothing away in return. "Your rooms are on the east wing," Etta said. "They were the Queen's rooms once. Before, they've been kept up." A pause. "They're warm." "That sounds fine," Mira said. "There's a door," Etta said carefully, "between the Queen's rooms and the King's study. It locks from both sides." Mira turned to look at her. The housekeeper's face was perfectly composed. "Noted," Mira said. She followed Etta inside, and the palace swallowed her whole. The rooms were warm, as promised. More than warm, full and generous, with high ceilings and deep-set windows that would flood them with eastern light in the morning, and a fireplace large enough to stand in with a fire already lit and burning well. The furniture was old and beautiful, each piece with the particular beauty of objects made to last centuries. She stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly, and her wolf moved through her like water through a new channel, tasting the scent of the place. Him, faint but present, saturating these walls like incense soaked into old wood. Years of it. The door. She'd noted it when Etta pointed, set into the wall between the dressing room and what she'd identified as a study or sitting room of her own. Dark oak, iron handle, plainly made. No ornamentation. A functional door between functional rooms. She didn't go near it. She ate the supper that came. Good food. Better than she'd expected. And she ate it all because she was hungry, and because it seemed like the right message to send herself about how she was handling this. She unpacked her bag. She set her mother's pressed flowers on the mantelpiece where she could see them from the bed. She found the lavender in a small cloth sachet tucked in the bag's pocket. An impulse from that morning, when she'd pulled the sprigs from the kitchen rafters without entirely knowing why. And she set that beside the flowers. She washed her face. She changed into the plain linen shift she slept in. She got into the bed, which was wide and high and very soft, and she pulled the good wool blanket from her bag and tucked it over the palace linens because it smelled like home. Then she lay in the dark and listened. The palace made sounds. All old buildings did. The settlement of stone, the complaint of wood, the conversation of wind in the chimneys. She catalogued them one by one, the way she catalogued remedies on a shelf, finding their order and their sense. Farther off, an owl. Closer, the muffled rhythm of a guard's footfall in the corridor, and through the wall. Footsteps, quiet and paced, back and forth, back and forth. He couldn't sleep either. She closed her eyes and thought about what Soren had said. His wolf had something to say about it. She thought about the bond seal, the press of his warm hand, the change in his breathing that she'd caught and kept without deciding to. She thought about Soren's careful voice. Not certain I'm the right person to answer. She thought about Etta's even more careful voice. It locks from both sides. She thought about her wolf, and what her wolf had done when his scent first crossed the kitchen threshold that morning. Interested, afraid, something between. The footsteps on the other side of the wall continued their slow, deliberate pacing, and she lay still and breathed and did not look at what she was feeling directly. Not yet. Let it sit at the edge of vision. Let herself get used to it. She did not sleep for a long time. When she finally did, she dreamed of rain. Morning found him in his study before the palace was properly awake, which was where he usually was, which was where he usually wanted to be. Before the council, before the correspondence, before Soren arrived with whatever the day intended to present him with. These hours were the quietest of his day, and he had learned to hoard them. He stood at the window with his coffee, real coffee, imported from the southern territories at considerable expense and worth every fraction of it, and looked at the eastern courtyard below and thought about the door in his study wall. He hadn't touched it. He hadn't touched it, hadn't stood near it, had in fact reorganized the papers on his desk purely to give himself something to do on the opposite side of the room. Which was not, he acknowledged to himself with the cold clarity he tried to apply to everything, the behavior of a man executing a political maneuver. He pressed the back of his fingers against his jaw. His wolf moved in him like something changing tide. He had been 24 when he took the kingship. He'd had almost no time to be young and therefore very little practice at impulse. Soren had seen to the administration of the realm while Calder saw to its protection, and the years had gone by in a particular rhythm. Campaigns and councils and the long work of keeping 7 pack territories from tearing each other to pieces. He had not allowed himself the luxury of mate bonds and what they required, which was the kind of openness he had systematically closed off. He knew this about himself. He'd decided it consciously. The opening was too dangerous. Then he had smelled her from halfway down the hall of Aldrich Voss's estate, and his wolf had done something that had no name, and he had made himself walk the rest of that distance on pure political will, because if he'd let his wolf do it, he would have been running. He set his coffee down. This had been a plan about Aldrich Voss, about a debt and a message, and the clean, cold satisfaction of an insult, returned with interest. He had chosen Mira Voss because she was the overlooked one, because using the prized daughter would have been too much power given to her father's pride, because Soren had handed him the file and pointed to her name, and his wolf had stood up like a compass finding north. He had not, he admitted to himself now, thought past the wedding. Behind him the door clicked. He turned. She was standing in the doorway, still in her sleeping shift, plain linen, practical, her dark braid loose and sleep soft. She was carrying a book, and she had clearly come through the door without expecting him to be on this side of it, because she stopped as completely as if she'd walked into a wall. She caught herself. I didn't realize. It's all right. He kept his voice even. I'll go back. She was already stepping backward, her hand finding the door handle. Mira. She stopped. Sit down, he said. And then, because it came out like an order, which it had been, which it shouldn't be. If you want to, there's coffee. A pause. He watched her read the room, him, the desk, the distance between them, the window, the calculation behind those amber eyes. Coffee, she said, would be appreciated. She sat in the chair by the fire, book held in her lap, and he poured a second cup and set it on the small table beside her and went back to the window. 12 feet between them. He could track her by scent from here with perfect clarity, and what he was reading from her was not what he'd expected. Not fear, not resentment, curiosity, and under that, carefully contained, something that warmed the whole register of it. What are you reading? He said. She showed him the spine. A treatise on pack territory law, 300 years old. I found it on the shelf in the sitting room. I assumed borrowing it was acceptable. He looked at her. It's a dry text, he said. I find the dry ones reassuring, she said. Everything's already settled, no surprises. And you prefer no surprises. Something moved through her face. I used to, she said. And then she opened the book and began to read, clearly signaling that she was done with that particular thread. And he turned back to the window and drank his coffee, and his wolf lay down with the contented weight of something that had been waiting a long time to do this. He thought about the council meeting in 3 hours. He thought about the eastern border dispute he was supposed to resolve by the end of the month. He thought about Aldrich Voss, eating his humiliation in the Northern Reach. He thought about none of these things, actually. He thought about the word she'd used to. The days found a shape, the way days do. She did not expect it. She had expected to be housed like furniture, present, ignored, somewhere between decorative and invisible. She had expected hollow courtesy at best, and at worst the particular brand of dismissal that powerful men gave to women they'd decided to catalog as insignificant. She had not expected the coffee. Not just that first morning. Every morning. She woke and went through the study door, and the coffee was there, already poured. And sometimes he was at the window, and sometimes he was at the desk, and once he was not there at all. But the coffee was. That small fact settled into her the way small facts did. Quietly, without announcement. Arranging itself beside everything else she was cataloging and declining to name. She found the palace libraries on the second day. 3 rooms of them, 1 off the main corridor and 2 hidden behind panels in the east wing that a young footman named Thomas showed her when she asked him what was behind a suspicious-looking stretch of wall. Thomas had a gap between his front teeth and the earnest manner of someone who had recently discovered that being useful to interesting people was more rewarding than being invisible to powerful ones. He became, by the 3rd day, something close to a guide. She learned the palace through him and through her own unhurried walking of corridors. The great hall where the council met, which smelled of old deliberations and fresh ink. The training yard where the guard ran drills from dawn to mid-morning, which she could watch from a second-floor window and sometimes did. The infirmary, which she found by following the scent of valerian and boneset, and introduced herself to the palace healer, an elderly woman named Phyra, who had tight white braids and hands as sure as any she'd ever seen, and who looked her over with assessing eyes and said, "You know remedies?" And when Mira answered honestly, put her to work. That was unexpected too, the being put to work. But she had spent her whole life in motion, and the alternative was sitting in her fine rooms and thinking about the footsteps through the wall. So she wrapped her hair back and learned where Phyra kept everything, and was grateful. "The Alpha King's wife," Phyra said on the 3rd afternoon, not looking up from the poultice she was making. "Doing infirmary work. The Alpha King's wife has nothing else scheduled," Mira said. Phyra made a sound that was possibly agreement. "He'll hear about it," Phyra said. "The staff talks." "Good," Mira said, and handed her the comfrey. He heard about it by the 4th day. She knew because when she came through the study door that morning he was waiting, standing rather than sitting, which told her he'd decided to intercept her, which told her it mattered to him, which she filed carefully beside the coffee and the used to. "Phyra says you're working in the infirmary," he said. Phyra needed help with the supply inventory. "You're not a servant. I know." She reached past him for the coffee cup. He was close, closer than usual. The usual 12 feet collapsed to something under 4. His scent was very clear at this proximity, and she focused on the cup rather than on what that clarity was doing to her wolf. "I find the work useful. If it bothers you." "It doesn't bother me." "Then why are you standing in front of the coffee?" A pause. He stepped back. Actually stepped back. 1 deliberate half-step, as if recalibrating the distance. She watched it happen with her peripheral vision and did not smile. "I wanted to make sure you're—" He stopped. Started again. "If there's anything you need, rooms, staff, access to—" "I have what I need," she said. She looked at him now, directly. The infirmary is what I need. He held her gaze for 2 breaths. All right, he said. She took her coffee back to the chair by the fire, and she opened her book, and she was aware of him watching her from the window for a long moment before he turned away. Her wolf was keeping a very detailed account of each of these moments. She tried not to read its ledger. The council meeting on the 7th day was the first time she heard herself used as a weapon, and it came from the direction she least expected. She wasn't in the council chamber. She hadn't been invited, hadn't asked to be, had been content to let the political machinery run without her as it clearly intended to. But the council chamber shared a wall with the large map room where she'd taken to working, and the palace walls were old, and she was sitting at the table with Fyra's inventory and a set of notes when she heard her name, not her full name, just the Voss girl. And then, marriage to such a creature reflects on the crown itself. An insult to Voss is an insult to the Reach, and an insult to the Reach is Lord Cavendish, the Alpha King's voice, flat as hammered iron. I am only stating what others in this room are thinking. The voice she'd identified as Cavendish, deep, measured, the voice of a man who believed in the importance of his own opinions. The Northern Reach is not a trivial territory. Using the Alpha King's marriage as a political jab, however satisfying to Lord Cavendish. A pause. We're done with this topic, the Alpha King said. She sat very still in the map room. Her coffee had gone cold. Outside the window, a crow made its sharp, single-syllable argument with the day, and then went quiet. The meeting moved on. She stayed where she was and looked at Fyra's inventory numbers without seeing them, and reminded herself she had always known what this was. The reminder landed differently than it usually did. There was a bruise quality to it now. She heard the council chamber clear an hour later. She heard footsteps in the corridor, Soren's. She'd learned his footfall, light and quick. Then heavier footsteps, pausing outside the map room door. The door opened. He stood in the frame and looked at the inventory she was pretending to work on, and then at her face, and his jaw worked. That particular muscle she'd started tracking. The one that moved when he was deciding what to say, and rejecting each option. You heard, he said. The walls are thin. He came into the room. He sat down across the table from her, which he'd never done. They'd always been separated by the width of a room or the safety of the window. He sat across from her and she looked at him directly and waited. Cavendish is a political calculator, he said. Everything he says is strategy. I know what he is. She kept her voice level. He was stating the thing everyone in that room is already thinking. Not everyone. Most. She looked down at her notes. It's all right. I came into this knowing what I was. Mira. I'm not performing injury, she said clearly. I genuinely... It's not all right. His voice came out rougher than she'd heard it, the control slightly compressed, like something being held at pressure. It was a cheap shot, and he knew what it was when he was making it. She looked up. His face was doing the thing it sometimes did, the thing she'd caught the edge of in the courtyard, in the study, in a dozen moments she'd catalogued without naming, the thing she was most afraid to look at directly. You didn't correct him, she said carefully, when he called it a political jab. No. Is that still what it is? The silence that followed was the longest one she'd heard from him. Her wolf was very loud in that silence. She kept her breathing even and watched his face and waited. I don't know, he said at last. She had expected dismissal or deflection or the cool, clean evasion he was capable of. She had not expected the honesty of those 3 words, delivered without decoration, sitting in the air between them like something new and undefended. She didn't know what to do with it. I'm going to finish the inventory, she said. He nodded. He didn't leave. He sat across from her with his hands flat on the table, and she bent over her notes, and they were in the same room and not speaking, and her wolf lay down and breathed slow, satisfied breaths, and she made herself focus on the numbers. He left after an hour. He left quietly. He didn't say goodnight. She sat with the inventory for a long time after he'd gone, listening to the sound the palace made when it settled, and she let herself feel, very quietly, the thing she'd been setting aside since the kitchen door. She had a flaw. She'd always known it, even when she'd lacked the precise language for it. She was a fixer, not in the warm sense, not the person who held you together when you were falling. In the cooler, more methodical sense. She saw broken things and she calculated the repair before she calculated whether the repair was hers to make. Fyra's inventory. The palace healer's supply chain, which had been a controlled disaster of mislabeled bottles and outdated stock lists. Tomas's slightly off approach to fire laying that was wasting good hardwood. The hound in the far courtyard that had been limping for 2 days before anyone noticed. She'd noticed. She'd found the thorn. She'd had it out and poulticed in under 10 minutes. And the hound had followed her around the courtyard afterward with the devotion of the newly converted. She fixed things. The problem with this flaw, and it was a flaw, she'd understood that since she was 15 and had tried to fix her father's relationship with his tenants through a series of carefully orchestrated meetings and had made everything worse, was that it did not discriminate. It pointed itself at people as readily as at supply lists. And once it pointed, it was very hard to redirect. She knew what she was doing, these mornings in the study. She knew what she was doing when she noticed the coffee was always prepared, but he never ate before 10, and she started bringing bread from the kitchen, just setting it on the desk without comment, and he ate it without comment, and neither of them mentioned it. She knew what she was doing when she began to notice the quality of his silences. Which ones were thinking silences and which ones were tired. Silences and which ones, rarer, were a different register entirely that she didn't have a clean category for yet. She was cataloging him. She was calculating the repair. The problem was she didn't know what was broken. Not yet. But she could feel it. A weight behind everything. Some structure that had been under strain for long enough that the strain had become normal. She knew that quality. She'd grown up in a house full of it. She asked Soren, one afternoon in the second week, because asking Soren seemed safer than asking the man himself, and she'd decided that she would rather have information than comfortable ignorance. They were walking the perimeter of the East Garden. Her idea, his agreement. In the easy way Soren agreed to things he'd already been considering. He had a small journal he carried in his coat pocket that he never wrote in her presence, but that she suspected he wrote in prolifically in her absence. "What happened with his father?" she said. Soren looked at the garden wall. "What has he told you?" "Nothing. Then perhaps that's information." "That's a very careful non-answer. I specialize in those." The finger went to the lip. A pause, longer than usual. His father's death wasn't clean, not unexpected. Aaron Vane had been ill for 2 years. The pack knew it. But the manner of it was... He stopped. There were accusations after, about who had been informed, who had not been, who had benefited from the succession happening when it did rather than later. Calder was 24, and he had 3 council members and 2 territory lords suggesting, publicly, that he had engineered his own father's decline. Soren's voice was even. He didn't. It was investigated, thoroughly. But the investigation was visible, which meant the accusation was visible, which meant... He learned that people who seem to care about you can recalculate at any time, she said. Soren looked at her. "Yes," he said simply. She thought about that for the rest of the walk. She thought about it that evening, in the study, while he was at the window with the last light and she was pretending to read. She thought about a 24-year-old with a new crown and an open wound, building the kind of distance you need when you decide that opening is too dangerous. She thought about what it cost him to say "I don't know." She thought about her wolf, and what it had been saying steadily and patiently since the kitchen door, and what it would mean if she finally listened. The accident in the infirmary was her fault, which she admitted immediately, which Fira accepted with the practical grace of someone who'd been dealing with accidents in infirmaries for 30 years. She'd been reaching for a bottle on the high shelf, the heavy valerian concentrate, glass stopper, full, and she'd caught the edge of the lower shelf on the way down, and the bottle had tipped, and she'd caught it. But the edge had caught the inside of her forearm in the process, and opened a clean, unpleasant slice from wrist to elbow. Fira had looked at it, looked at her, and gone for the needle and thread. "I can do it myself," Mira said. "You can try," Fira said pleasantly, "with your non-dominant hand and a 3-inch wound on your dominant arm. Or you can sit down." She sat down. She was sitting with her arm bandaged and her sleeve cut off at the elbow, waiting for Fira to finish the supply count she'd interrupted, when the infirmary door opened and the Alpha King walked in. He stopped. She watched him read the scene, the bandage, the cut sleeve, the smell of blood that even bandaged would be clear to any wolf in the room. His nostrils flared, his jaw set. "It's not serious," she said immediately. "What happened?" "A shelf. I'm fine." He crossed the room. Fira looked up, looked between them, and found something urgently needing her attention on the far side of the infirmary. Mira watched the healer's strategic retreat with something between amusement and apprehension. He crouched in front of her chair. His face was very close to her arm, close enough that she felt the warmth of him, and his fingers came up and stopped just short of touching the bandage. "Can I look?" he said. She stared at him. At the top of his head, the crown of dark hair, the visible tension in his shoulders. "Yes," she said. He was careful, that controlled precision she'd noticed in everything he did, except now it was applied to unwrapping the bandage and assessing the stitching, and his hands were warm and steady, and she watched his face, and what she saw there was not what she'd have predicted, not the cool assessment of a political inconvenience. His brow was drawn, his breathing was slightly altered, not much, barely perceptible, but she was very close, and she'd learned his breathing. "It's clean," he said. "She did good work." He began to rewrap it carefully. "I told you it wasn't serious," she said. "You tell me things aren't serious when they are." He didn't look up. "I've been watching you do it for 2 weeks." Her breath caught. He finished the rewrapping. His hands stayed on her arm for 1 moment, then 2, just resting there, the warmth of his palms against the linen. He seemed to notice simultaneously that he wasn't moving and that she'd stopped breathing, and he lifted his hands slowly and stood up, putting the standard distance between them. "You should rest it today," he said. "I have work too." "Rest it today," he said again, and there was something in his voice that she hadn't heard before, something that was related to a request but lived in different territory, something that sounded almost like please without using the word. She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. He nodded. He turned to go. He made it to the door. "Calder?" she said. He stopped. He didn't turn immediately. She watched the stillness between his shoulder blades. Then he turned. She didn't know what she'd been going to say. She hadn't planned it. But it was the first time she'd said his name, not his title. And something had shifted in the room when she said it, something barometric, and she didn't want to waste it. "Thank you," she said, "for the bandage, for coming." His face did the thing it did, that edge she was always catching. "I came because your scent changed," he said. "I was in the East Corridor and your scent changed and I—" He stopped, collected himself. "It's a reasonable response to injury." "It is," she agreed gently. He held her gaze for one long moment that wasn't about reasonableness at all. And then he walked out, and she listened to his footsteps down the corridor until they faded. And then she sat in the infirmary chair and felt the warmth of his palms through the linen bandage and let herself look, for just a moment, at what her wolf had been saying all along. The thing she had been not thinking about arrived on the 14th day in the form of Lady Cressida Morn. She arrived the way beautiful women arrive when they know the effect. Not hurriedly, not with announcement, but with the particular quality of entrance that expects the room to orient to it. She came for a council dinner that Mira had not been included in, and she came in a dress the color of deep water with her pale hair loose in a fashion that was almost informal but not quite, and she stood in the great hall with the ease of someone returning to a room she'd always considered hers. Mira heard about it from Thomas, which was to say she heard about it in a rush of excited whispered detail delivered while he was laying the second sitting room fire, and she was reading in the chair nearby, and the detail included: Cressida Morn was the daughter of the Western Reach Lord. She had been at court 3 years ago before the current campaign. She had been, Thomas lowered his voice here, expected by some to become the king's mate before the political situation changed, and she was widely considered the most beautiful woman in the 7 territories, and was clearly here to remind everyone of that fact. Mira turned a page of her book. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. He blinked. "I thought you'd want to know." "I do want to know," she said. "I just don't want to react in a way that suggests I'm not in control of my own emotions." He thought about this. That's very mature," he said, with the tone of someone filing it away for later. She went to the council dinner. She had not been specifically invited, and she had not been specifically uninvited, and she decided that her absence would be more commented on than her presence. And she put on the best dress she'd packed, which was dark green wool with embroidery at the cuffs that she'd done herself one very long winter. And she went. Cressida Morn was seated 3 places to the Alpha King's right. Mira was seated 6 places to his left. She ate well, and she listened and she spoke to the council members on either side of her, with the comfortable attentiveness of someone not performing her own comfort, and she let herself be where she was. She watched him. She couldn't help that. But she watched carefully, the way she catalogued the palace sounds at night. For information, not for injury. He was cordial to Cressida. No more. The particular quality of his attention was distributed evenly across the table, and it was only because she had spent 2 weeks learning his face that she could read the difference between his public manners and the thing she'd seen in the infirmary that afternoon. Public manners were smooth and comprehensive. The other thing was rarer, more particular. Cressida, she noted, was watching him with an intent that was much less concealed than it thought it was. After the dessert course, Cavendish, she'd identified him now. A broad man with a gray-blonde beard and the careful mouth of a trained negotiator, leaned toward his neighbor and said something she didn't catch, but she caught the word. She was close enough to lip-read it, or close enough to her own instincts, which had been honed on years of conversations not meant for her ears. Insult. And his neighbor's response, equally quiet. Can't last. She set down her wine glass, carefully, evenly. Across the table, 6 seats down, the Alpha King's eyes moved to her face. She hadn't been looking at him in that moment. She looked now, and he was watching her with an intensity that startled her, And what she read in his scent, she was close enough, in the warmth of the dining room to read it clearly, was not the dinner's public evenness. It was something heightened. Something that was partly anger and partly something older. Something that moved at a lower frequency. She held his gaze for one measured moment. She lifted her wine glass again and took a deliberate sip and let her eyes move away. The dinner ended. In the corridor after, Cressida materialized beside her with the smoothness of someone who had always been able to position herself wherever she chose. "You're holding up remarkably well," Cressida said. Her voice was warm. Her eyes were doing the full assessment. "Given the situation." "The situation is comfortable," Mira said. "Good rooms, good coffee, good work." Cressida's smile adjusted fractionally. "I only mean, everyone knows what this was. You needn't pretend otherwise with me." "I'm not pretending anything," Mira said. "I'm simply not having the conversation you've prepared." A pause. Something moved through Cressida's expression. Surprise. Recalibration. "He's not available to you," Cressida said. Quieter now. Cleaner. "Whatever you've been told. Whatever this looks like from inside it." Mira looked at her. A full, even look. "I'll keep that in mind," she said pleasantly, and excused herself and walked back through the east wing to her rooms. She didn't let herself feel it until the door was closed. She stood in the center of her good warm room and let the dinner settle over her, and she breathed through the tightness in her chest. The particular quality of it. Not anger exactly. Sharper than hurt. The sensation of something she'd been keeping carefully managed slipping its leash. Through the wall, the study was quiet. No footsteps. She sat by the fire and pressed her hands flat on her knees, and she was honest with herself. The way she was honest with inventories and wound assessments and weather changes. She was honest with herself about what she felt. She was honest about what she wanted. She didn't go through the door. She sat with the honesty and the firelight and the weight of her mother's pressed flowers on the mantelpiece, and she let the night pass. He found her 2 days later in the outer library, the one off the main corridor, not the hidden rooms, sitting on the floor with her back against the shelves and a book open in her lap, and her bandaged arm resting on her knee. She had her shoes off. Her feet were tucked under the hem of her dress. She looked, for the first time since she'd arrived, completely unguarded. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he should have. She looked up. And then, because she was who she was, she didn't scramble or apologize. She just tilted her head slightly and waited to see what he'd do. He came in. He sat down against the opposite shelf, his legs extended, his back to the books. The library smelled of dust and beeswax and old paper and her particular scent, warm and herbal. The lavender that was beginning to show up in places throughout the East Wing in small, quiet ways, as if the palace were slowly being threaded through with it. "What are you reading?" he said. She showed him the spine, a field guide to medicinal plants of the Northern Territories, illustrated. "Fira's," she said. She lent it. "How's the arm?" "Healing. She did good work." She looked at the page and then at him. You knew Cressida Morn. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "Before." "Yes." She turned a page. "She came to speak to me, after dinner." He was quiet for a moment. "What did she say?" "That you weren't available to me." She said it evenly, without pointing. She was trying to be helpful, I think, from her perspective. "From her perspective," he repeated. "She's still in love with you," Mira said, in the tone of someone providing a useful piece of information. "I don't think she knows how obvious it is." His jaw worked. "Mira, I'm not making an accusation." She looked at him now, fully. Telling you what I see. Because I've found that telling you what I see is more useful than not telling you. He held her gaze. What else do you see? She considered him. The long lines of him. The comfortable way he'd arranged himself on the library floor as if he'd done it before. As if libraries were a place he came to, which she hadn't known and had just discovered and was filing quietly alongside everything else. I see someone who decided a long time ago that being careful was safer than being open, she said. And I see what that cost. And I see. She stopped. Go on. Her hands were still on the book. She was aware of the distance between them, not 12 feet this time, barely 3, the width of the corridor between the shelves. She could smell him very clearly. That clean rain and cedar note, and under it the darker frequency that was his want, and he didn't know she could read it. I see that you came in here, she said. Twice in 3 weeks you've come to wherever I was. Not Soren, not a steward. You. You're my responsibility, he said. Is that what that is? The silence. He looked at her hands, at the book, at the floor between them. I arranged this marriage, he said, because your father broke a land agreement 2 years ago that cost 3 villages their water supply through a winter. He called it a clerical error. It wasn't. His voice was very level. I could have taken it to the council. I could have pressed territory sanctions. I chose a different approach. I know, she said. You knew? His eyes came up. I knew the rough shape of it. Soren. She paused. Soren told me some things. I'd already inferred others. I know who my father is. Her voice didn't waver, which took effort. I've been watching him my whole life. I used you, he said. You tried to. She kept her gaze steady. I'm not sure it worked the way you planned. Something cracked open in his face. Not breaking, more like a window, a fraction. No, he said. It didn't. She let that sit, let it have its full weight. What you did was wrong, she said quietly. Choosing me as a tool. I need you to know that I know that. She watched him take it, watched the muscle in his jaw. And I'm not. She stopped again, reordered. I don't think you're a cruel man. I think you're a man who was hurt in a way that taught him that precision was protection, and sometimes precision bleeds. His breathing had changed. She was close enough. I'm not forgiving you, she said. I'm just telling you what I see. You can do what you want with it. He was looking at her with an expression she had no clean name for, something that lived in the same territory as those early morning silences, as the coffee and the bread and the careful wrap of a bandage. I don't know what I'm doing, he said. I know. Something warm moved through her chest. Neither do I. That's the first time both of those things have been true simultaneously in my experience. A breath moved through him. Not quite a laugh. Something adjacent. The first time, she repeated, softer. He looked at her hands. She looked at his. The library was very quiet. I should, he began. Probably, she said. Neither of them moved. There is a kind of knowledge that lives in the body before the mind catches up to it. She had known this, academically, from Remedy's work, from the biology of wolf nature, from things Fira had said about how the body announces what it knows before the mouth can form it. She had known it from the outside. She learned it from the inside on the 18th day. She had been in the outer garden in the late afternoon, the hour when the light went amber and horizontal, and made the palace stone look like something from a much older world. She was sitting on the low wall that edged the herb beds, Fira's kitchen herb section, not the decorative garden, cataloging what was overwintered and what would need replanting. She had a small notebook she'd found in the desk in her sitting room. She'd been using it for a while. She heard them before she saw them. A group of men crossing the garden path from the training yard, Guards. Their practice session finished, heading toward the inner courtyard. Loud. Easy. The specific quality of male camaraderie that fills a space and expects it to stay filled. And at the edge of the group, not speaking, watching her as they passed, Lord Cavendish's son. She'd seen him at the council dinner, young, broad-shouldered, with his father's assessing eyes and something extra in them when they'd met hers across the table. The same something now, as his pace slowed and the group moved past him and he stopped. "Lady Mira," he said. He made her title sound like a question. She said, which was polite but not an invitation. He came to the wall anyway, leaned against the stone with the easy grace of someone who'd been charming his way into conversations his whole life and found it worked. "You've been settling in," he said. "I have. It suits you. The work, the infirmary. I heard about Fyra." His smile was practiced and genuine at the same time, which she filed as a small accomplishment. "My father thinks—" He paused. "My father's assessments aren't always the final word." "I know," she said. "I meant—" He shifted. "I meant that for the people who are actually looking, you're—" He seemed to decide on directness. "You're more interesting than the situation implies." She looked at him carefully. He wasn't being cruel. He was being something more complicated than cruel. He was being genuine, within the limits of who he was, and she read it clearly. "That's kind of you," she said, and meant it, and also meant, "I see what you're doing and I'm not interested," without saying it. She was so focused on the conversation that she missed the sound from the upper window. What she did not miss was the scent that arrived a half-second before she heard the footstep behind her. That sharp change, the barometric shift from his usual controlled register into something she had no clean name for, but that her wolf reacted to immediately. A full-body reaction. Everything in her orienting. She turned. He was standing 12 feet away on the garden path, and he had clearly just come from the inner door. And he was looking at Cavendish's son with an expression that was perfectly still and entirely unreadable, except to anyone who knew his face well, and she knew his face well. Cavendish's son straightened. His smile collapsed into something more careful. "Alpha King," he said. Silence. One beat. "Mira," the Alpha King said. Just her name. She slid off the wall and picked up her notebook and crossed to him. She didn't look at Cavendish's son again. She stopped beside Calder, close, closer than the 12 feet, and the scent she was reading from him was complicated and layered, and she let herself read the bottom of it and stored it very carefully. Cavendish's son made a brief farewell and walked quickly in the direction his companions had gone. She and the Alpha King stood in the herb garden. "He's harmless," she said. "I know." His voice was compressed, something under pressure. She turned her face up toward him. He was looking straight ahead, jaw set, that muscle working. "Calder?" she said. He looked down at her. She held his gaze, held it. Let him see whatever was on her face. She'd stopped managing her face for him several days ago. She wasn't entirely sure when. "You don't have to compete with anyone," she said quietly. "There's no one to compete with." His breath came out, long, slow, like something he'd been holding. She looked back at the herb beds. "The rosemary needs cutting back," she said. "If it goes into spring like this, it'll run." A pause. "I'll have someone," he began. "I'll do it," she said. "I like doing it." She felt him looking at the side of her face. She kept her attention on the rosemary. "Come inside when you're done," he said. He stopped. "There'll be food." She smiled at the rosemary. "There'll be food," she repeated. "I'll eat before 10 for once." "That's nearly a promise." She heard him make a sound she'd never heard from him. Brief, low, partly suppressed. A laugh. A real one. Caught off guard. The kind that didn't get approval before it arrived. He walked back inside. She sat down in the dirt beside the rosemary and put her hands in the cold soil and let herself feel, fully, without the managed distance, the exact shape of what was happening to her. Midwinter arrived the way the North announces things. Overnight, without negotiation. She woke to the particular silence of new snow and went to the window, and the world had gone white and clean. The courtyard and the gardens and the far hills all reduced to their shapes. Everything else erased. She stood at the window in the early dark, and her wolf moved through her with a restlessness she recognized. Not anxiety. Something else. Anticipation of a kind she'd learned, in the past 3 weeks, to associate with a specific set of circumstances. She went through the study door. He was there. At the window, as he was at the window most mornings. The coffee already poured. Hers on the small table, his on the desk edge. He was looking at the snow, and she came to stand beside him, which she hadn't done before. She'd always taken the chair. This was the window, which was his territory, and she came to stand beside him, and she looked at the snow, and she felt the closeness of him, the warmth, the current of his presence at 3 feet that she had been acutely aware of for going on 2 weeks. "I didn't hear you last night," she said. "You slept." He looked at her, sideways, surprised. "I usually hear you," she said. "Through the wall, when you can't sleep." A pause. "How long have you been—" "Since the first night." She looked at the snow. "It's all right. I couldn't sleep either. Mira." "I just wanted you to know," she said, "that I noticed, that I was on the other side of the wall, and I noticed, and I was—" She stopped, chose the word honestly. "I was aware of you." The snow was very still. In the courtyard below, a sparrow landed and left its precise small print and was gone. He turned from the window. She turned with him, and they were facing each other with the window light going white cold behind her, and the fire going gold warm behind him, and she was close enough that she could see the individual lines at the corners of his eyes that weren't aging, exactly. Just the record of years of looking carefully at things. "I arranged this marriage to make a point to your father," he said. His voice was even, deliberate. "I chose you specifically because—" He stopped. "Because your wolf had something to say about it," she said. Soren's words, those weeks ago. Something moved across his face. "I thought I could contain it. Use the political purpose. Keep the rest." "Managed," she said. "Yes." He looked at her, and the looking was— She'd catalogued his looks for 3 weeks, and this one had no category. "I didn't plan this part." "I know," she said. "I'm not good at—" He paused. The next word seemed to cost something. "Open." "I know that too." "You terrify me," he said. She blinked. It was the last thing she'd expected. Not the words. She might have anticipated some version of the sentiment, but the directness of it, the completeness. He said it like a statement of fact, like a field report, and somehow that made it worse and better simultaneously. "Why?" she said. "Because you fix things." His jaw worked. "You walk into a room and you see what's wrong and you mend it. Quietly, without making a claim. And I've been watching you do it in every room of this palace for 3 weeks and—" He stopped. "And I am not a room to be mended." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "You're not." She looked at his hands, flat against his thighs, the controlled stillness of them. "But I'm also not. This isn't the same thing. What I feel for you isn't the same mechanism. How do you know?" Because fixing things doesn't hurt, she said simply. This does. She met his eyes. I'm telling you this because I've decided I'm done managing it. Because I've watched you be honest with me in increments for 3 weeks and you deserve the same. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. I don't know what this is. I don't know what the bond is doing or what your wolf decided in my father's hall or what any of it means. But I'm aware of you constantly. And I came through that door every morning because of that, not for the coffee, and you need to know. He stood very still. I need to know, he repeated. Yes. The fire shifted behind him and threw a new quality of light across his face, and she watched something happen in it. Not crack, not collapse, but change. A different configuration of the same elements. A new alignment. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. His fingers barely touched her cheek. She held her breath. He dropped his hand. The council has a session in 2 hours, he said. She exhaled. I know. And Cavendish is bringing a formal objection. About the marriage registration. His voice was careful. He has the right to, technically. The paperwork is a political instrument, she finished. Yes. His eyes were on her face, steady and searching. I wanted you to know before the session. She looked at him. She thought about what this cost him to say. The warning, the transparency, the choice to tell her rather than let her find out from the corridor walls. She thought about 24 and an open wound, and the long work of deciding that closing was survival. What are you going to do? She said. I don't know yet, he said. That's the second time you've said that to me. I know. The ghost of that laugh, caught before it fully arrived. It's new. She picked up her coffee. She went to the chair. She opened her book, which was still the Pack Territory law text, because she found the dry ones reassuring. Everything already settled. I'll be in the infirmary until the session, she said. If you need me. His breath came out slow. I'll know where to find you, he said. She heard the council session from the map room again, but this time she was there on purpose. Cavendish laid his objection with the precision of a man who had prepared it carefully. She listened to the case. The marriage registration had been filed with a note indicating political intent, which, under Pack law territory, could be grounds for classification as a formal alliance instrument rather than a personal bond, which had different legal standing, which meant, his voice here went careful and professionally regretful, that dissolving it would require council consensus rather than a unilateral royal decision. He was protecting his position, she understood. He was making the marriage harder to undo so that its continuation would require ongoing justification and therefore ongoing council oversight. He was, in the cleanest political sense, preventing the Alpha King from acting unilaterally on what Cavendish had decided was a mistake. He was protecting the crown from an inconvenient attachment. Through the wall she heard the council reaction, murmurs, the sound of papers shuffling, Soren's voice, offering a counterinterpretation. Then silence. Then the Alpha King. The registration stands as filed, he said. His voice was perfectly level. My marriage is not a council instrument. It is mine. The registration will be amended this afternoon to reflect a personal bond declaration. More murmurs. Cavendish again, something she didn't fully catch. Then, I'm not interested in the council's feelings about my wife, the Alpha King said. The room went still. She is my wife, he said, cleaner, more absolute. And I will remind this council once, not again, that how I choose to treat the people in my house is not a matter for deliberation. A pause. Are there other items on the agenda? The session moved on. She was still sitting at the map room table with both hands flat on the wood, and her breathing slow when she heard the council chamber clear. She heard Soren's footfall in the corridor. She heard heavier footsteps, and then those footsteps paused outside the map room door. The door opened. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You heard," he said. "Yes. I should have." He came into the room, stopped in the center of it. "I should have talked to you first, before the session, about what I was going to do." She thought about it. "You warned me about Cavendish. You told me to prepare." "That's not the same as asking." "No," she agreed. "But it's also not nothing." He rubbed the back of his neck. A gesture she hadn't seen from him before. A private one. Not the controlled stillness she was used to. "I keep deciding things and then realizing I've decided them before I've told you," he said. "That's a pattern That's a failure of openness," she said gently. "Yes." She looked at him standing in the center of the map room. This king who had spent 7 years building distance into architecture, who had decided at 24 that precision was protection, and had been protecting ever since, who had told her she terrified him with the tone of someone filing a weather report. "You called me your wife," she said. "You are my wife." "I know. I just..." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I wanted to hear you say it, not as a political statement. Here." He crossed the room, not 12 feet, not 4. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to keep his eyes. "You are my wife," he said, quietly, completely. Her breath came out in a slow, deliberate exhale. His hand came up to her jaw, the same careful precision as the bandage, as the hair at the window, the same controlled warmth, and he tipped her face up and he kissed her. It was not long. It was not. She had expected, if this moment ever came, something large and devastating. A wave. This was not a wave. This was a still point. His mouth against hers, warm and certain and present in a way that felt like a door opening rather than a gate crashing down. And her hand came up and found the front of his coat and held there. And the map room was very quiet around them. And when he lifted his head, she kept her hand where it was. She looked at him. His eyes were very dark and very close. "The council," she said. "Can wait," he said. "Soren is going to have a thought about this." "Soren always has a thought," he said, and she felt the words more than heard them, and she understood in that moment what it cost him to stand here in the map room in the afternoon light and choose not to manage this, to let it be a thing that was happening to him rather than a thing he was directing. She moved her thumb against his coat. "I'm afraid of this too," she said. "I know. I just want that on record." "Noted," he said. And he was holding her face in both hands now, and the ghost of the laugh was in his voice, and this time it arrived. She felt it against her temple when he pressed his lips there. A real laugh, brief and unplanned and entirely his. That night she did not go back through the door. She stayed in her rooms as she had for 18 nights, and she sat by her fire with her mother's pressed flowers on the mantelpiece, and her wolf warm and settled in her chest, and she thought about everything that had happened since a kitchen door had opened onto a cold morning and changed the smell of the world. Through the wall, no footsteps. He slept. She did too. But in the morning, she did not go through the door. She waited. She had barely finished dressing when a knock came from the study side. She stood in the center of her room and felt it through the wood. She opened her door. He was standing in his own doorway, coffee in both hands. He had the look of a man who had thought carefully about this for the last 2 hours, and had decided the act itself was simpler than the thinking. "I thought I'd bring it to you," he said. She looked at him, at the coffee, at the small, careful thing this was. "That's almost a gesture," she said. "I'm working up to gestures." He offered the cup. "This is a preliminary gesture." She took it. The warmth of the cup, his warmth still on the ceramic. "What does a completed gesture look like?" she said. He considered. "I thought I might show you the Eastern Tower, the view from the top, in the snow." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "That sounds cold." "It is cold," he agreed. "But it's the best view on the property. I've never—" He stopped. "I don't go up there usually." She heard what he hadn't said. She heard it the way she heard everything through this wall, clearly, through the stone. "Give me time to find my boots," she said. The Eastern Tower stairs were steep and narrow, and in places the snow had come through the arrow slits and dusted the stone steps, and she held the rough rope handrail and climbed, and he was just ahead of her, his shoulders wide in the narrow space, and neither of them spoke. The top was open to the sky, a crenellated platform with 4 arrow slits, and a view that made the silence of the climb worth every cold step. The world was white, the territories spread out below in every direction, white and gray and the dark mark of forests, and in the far east the mountain range was a wall of pure ice against a sky going pale, rose and gold as the sun cleared it, and the whole of it, this world she'd been carried to in a lacquered carriage and married into with flower on her wrists, was enormous and quiet and lit. She stood and looked at it. He stood beside her. "My father brought me up here once," he said, "when I was about 10. He wanted to show me what I'd be responsible for someday." He looked at the mountains. "I think it was supposed to inspire a sense of duty. I think I just felt very small." She looked at the side of his face. "Did it work? The duty?" "Well," a pause. "I never went to war carelessly. That's not nothing." "No." His breath made a small cloud in the cold air. "He was a complicated man. My father. Not your father complicated." He glanced at her briefly. "Different. He wanted the right things. He just wanted them loudly. Everything he felt came out at full volume." She thought of what Soren had told her, the accusations, the investigation. "And then people used that," she said. "Yes. Clean and simple. They used the fact that he loved me to suggest that I would." "I know," she said. "You don't have to say it." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have told you," he said. "Before Soren. You were going to ask him eventually. I should have told you myself." She turned to him. "Why didn't you?" "Because if I told you," he said, "I would have had to admit that it's part of why I arranged the marriage the way I did. The coldness of it. Making it a transaction so I could tell myself it couldn't become anything else." "And then it became something else anyway," she said. "And then it became something else anyway." The sun had cleared the mountain. The gold moved across the white world below them, slow and comprehensive, lighting everything it touched. She reached between them and found his hand. His fingers closed around hers without hesitation, without the measured precision she was used to, just the immediate and complete fact of his grip. "I want you to tell me things," she said. "Not all at once, but when you know something I should know, I want you to tell me." "I know," he said. "And I'll tell you when I'm fixing things," she said. "When the mechanism is running, you can tell me to stop." His thumb moved across her knuckles. "I don't want you to stop," he said. I want you to know that I see it, that I'm not—" He stopped. "That I'm not a project." "You're not a project," she said, and she meant it to its depths. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the wind came up and brought the smell of the mountain ice and the cedar forests, and underneath it, warm and specific and present. Him. Just him. "I didn't plan any of this," he said. "One more time. For the record, neither did I." She held his hand in both of hers. "But I'd like to plan some of it, going forward. Together." Something opened in his face, fully, no edge catching, the whole center of it. She had been waiting for that without knowing she was waiting. "Yes," he said. It was not a large word. He said it quietly, in the cold, with the lit world spread out below them and her hands around his, and it was the most complete thing she had heard from him. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her slowly, with the care of someone learning a new thing, and determined not to get it wrong. Below them, the palace moved through its mourning. In the council chamber, Cavendish was probably preparing another objection. In the infirmary, Fira was probably reorganizing the supplies Mira had reorganized 3 days ago to Fira's own better system. Soren was somewhere below with his journal and his quiet thoughts, and his finger against his lip. In the northern reach, her father was eating his humiliation with the slow, grinding patience of a man who had already recalculated and would present a new approach in due time. None of that was finished. None of it would be. She breathed in the cold air and the smell of him and the particular quality of this morning, which was hers, which was theirs, which had been built out of a burned loaf of bread and a kitchen door and a bond that neither of them had authorized. His chin came down to rest on top of her head. They stood there until the cold worked through their coats, and then a little longer. She found the letter from her father that afternoon, waiting on the hall table where the morning correspondence was set. She knew his handwriting, small and compressed, the script of a man who had learned letters as a tool rather than a pleasure. She stood with it for a moment in the corridor. She opened it. It was short. She had expected appeals or arguments or the particular kind of manipulation that wore the costume of parental concern. Instead, it said, "I am told you are settled. I trust that to be correct. The water agreement with the eastern villages is being re-examined. There is nothing else to report." She folded it. She stood with the folded letter and thought about her father. The calculation that ran behind his eyes, the grip that was proprietary rather than tender, the 22 years of being ranked below a bread pan. She thought about the complicated truth of loving someone who had never quite seen you. She put the letter in her pocket. She would answer it. Not today, but she would answer it. She would say, "I am well. The palace suits me. The healer's infirmary has need of extra hands." She would say, "I am settled." She would not say the rest, not to him. That evening, in the study, she told Calder about the letter. She sat in the chair by the fire, and he sat on the edge of the desk, which was new. He was finding new positions in rooms now, as if the furniture had expanded its available configurations. And she read the letter to him aloud and then set it in her lap. "He'll recalibrate," she said. "Eventually. He always does." "I know." Something moved through his face. "I may have been cruder with the message than was strictly necessary." She raised her eyebrows. 22 years is a long time to watch someone be overlooked. "I know." She looked at him. "Is that—" She stopped, started again. "Did that factor in? When you decided to—" "Mira." His voice was quiet. "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. The peculiar layering of it, that his choice had been simultaneously cold, and, underneath the cold, something else, something that had seen her. "That's very complicated," she said at last. "Yes." "I'm not sure if it helps or makes it worse." "I know." He looked at his hands. Both, probably. She thought about her flaw, about calculating repairs before checking whether the repair was hers to make. She thought about how all flaws are made of the same material as strengths, just oriented differently. I'm choosing to interpret it as... She paused. As evidence that you're capable of more than you let yourself do. He looked up at her. Don't make me say it again, she said. It was already more than I'd planned on saying. The ghost of the laugh. I find your plans quite interesting, he said, given how often they encounter revision. Yours too. He nodded, conceded. His eyes were warm in the firelight, and she was aware, not for the first time, that he was the kind of beautiful that hides in a severe face and only shows itself when the face relaxes, and his face was relaxing, increment by increment, and she was the one watching it happen, and that was everything, actually. She looked back at the fire. She let it sit where it was. The days continued their work. The bond deepened the way her mother had once described it. Her mother, who had bonded with a man who didn't deserve it, but who had spoken of the bond itself with a particular clarity. Like a tide, her mother had said. Like something that doesn't ask. It just moves. She felt it moving. She felt it in the mornings and in the map room afternoons and in the sound of his breathing through the wall, which she still catalogued, still found anchoring in a way she couldn't fully justify. She felt it when she was in the infirmary, and he appeared in the doorway for no stated reason, and she didn't need a stated reason, and he knew that. She felt it one night at a formal dinner, a full council table, the territory lords visiting for a winter session, when he touched the small of her back as they entered the room. Brief, deliberate, public. The room read it. She read it. His hand dropped and they moved to their seats, and she spent the dinner feeling the ghost of the warmth and reading Cavendish's careful face across the table, and not minding what she read. She felt it when she caught Cressida Morn in the corridor 2 days later, and the woman looked at her differently now. Not with competition. With something Mira recognized as grief at its early stage. The grief of a woman who has been hoping, and who has recently, finally, understood she is hoping in the wrong direction. Mira didn't say anything useful. She didn't have anything useful to say. But she nodded, and Cressida nodded back, and it was clean. She felt it when Soren stopped her in the East Garden and pressed his small journal into her hands and said, "There's an entry you should read, from the day he chose you." She looked at him. "It's not private," Soren said carefully. "It's a work journal, political notes. But there's something in it." The finger left his lip. "He wouldn't show you himself. He's constitutionally incapable of it. So I am." She stood in the garden after Soren had gone and opened the journal to the marked page and read. Soren's handwriting was fine and precise. The entry was dated, the day before the wedding, the day before she'd burned the bread and heard the iron doors open, the day Soren had brought him the file. HM reviewed the Voss roster. When shown the second daughter's file, HM was quiet for approximately 30 seconds, long for him, and then closed the folder without speaking. I noted it. I noted that it was not the response he has given to any other political appointment in 8 years of advising him. When I asked what he was thinking, he said, "She tends the infirmary herself. It's in the regional notes." He said nothing else for the rest of the morning. I believe this is what people who know him less well than I do would call smitten. I believe what his wolf recognized, I cannot name. I believe this marriage, intended as a message to Voss, is going to be something considerably larger than that. I am choosing not to say this aloud. I am writing it here instead, for the record, because I am a man who documents things, and this deserves a document. She closed the journal. She stood in the cold garden with the closed journal against her chest, and she let herself feel, fully and without management, the the shape of a year she'd never anticipated living. A palace she'd arrived at with a bag and a burned loaf. A man who had chosen her in a corridor before she'd walked into the room. She tends the infirmary herself. She pressed her palm flat against the journal cover and breathed the cold air in, slow and deep, and her wolf was as settled and warm as she had ever felt it. She gave the journal back to Soren that evening. He took it without comment, without expression, and tucked it into his coat pocket. "You could have just told me," she said. "Yes," he said. "But telling you was his to do. I just showed you the evidence." The finger went to his lip. "He knows I showed you." "Does he?" "I told him I intended to." A pause. He said, "Of course you did," and left the room. She looked at Soren. "Is he?" "Embarrassed," Soren said, "which is, in 8 years, the only time I've seen that from him." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved through his face. I found it encouraging. She thought about that as she walked back through the east wing toward the study door. She thought about what it meant to be seen in a file before you were met in a room. She thought about 30 seconds of quiet and a man closing a folder and saying nothing for the rest of the morning. She opened the study door. He was at the window. He turned. He looked at her face and read it the way she'd learned to read his. She'd been watching that same skill develop in him for weeks, his wolf teaching him her language whether he authorized it or not. "You read it," he said. "Yes." "I was going to tell you." "I know." She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him. "She tends the infirmary herself." Something moved through his face, a fractional color shift, barely visible. "It's in the regional notes," he said, deflecting, and she thought, there it is. There is the thing that is exclusively his, this precise deflection, the way he retreats into the factual when the emotional is too close to the surface. "Calder," she said. "Yes." "You chose me before you met me." He held her gaze. "Yes, your wolf. My wolf." A pause. "And me, both." She nodded. She let it settle. "That terrifies me," she said, giving it back. His word. "I know. But I've decided it doesn't change what I'd choose if I were choosing freely." She looked at him carefully. "I want you to know that. I want it on record. Whatever the bond was doing, whatever your wolf decided in that corridor, I am choosing this, right now, separately from all of that." He was very still. "Tell me again," he said. She looked at him, at the window light, at his face in it, at the years of careful distance, and the first 30 seconds of silence over a closed folder and the small journal entry that had been waiting to be evidence. "I choose this," she said. "I choose you." He took her face in his hands, and she felt it through the palms. That warmth, always that warmth, controlled and warm in his. And he held her face as if it were the thing he'd been deciding how to hold for a very long time, and had finally decided correctly. "I choose you," he said. Against her forehead, her temple. "From the beginning, I chose you." She closed her eyes. The fire settled behind them. The palace moved through its evening outside the window, somewhere in the territories her father was calculating, and the council was deliberating, and the snow was still on the mountain peaks, and the world had all its unfinished business still waiting. None of it mattered right now. Right now there was only this room, his hands, the press of his forehead against hers, and 2 people who had come to each other through the wrong door and found themselves exactly where they were meant to be. The night was quiet, and they stayed in the study long after the fire burned low, and she fell asleep in the chair by the embers, and when she woke the fire was new built, and a blanket had been draped over her, and the morning light was coming in cold and clear, and he was at the desk, already working, his coffee at his elbow. He looked up when she moved. You could have woken me, she said. You were asleep. As if this settled it completely. She sat up and tucked the blanket around herself and looked at him across the room, and the light was doing something to the angles of his face, the honest, unguarded quality of a man simply present in his own room on an ordinary morning, and she thought, I will remember this. Exactly this. The low fire and the cold light and him at the desk in the ordinary business of living, and me in the chair with the blanket, and neither of us performing anything for anyone. Coffee? He said. Please, she said. He stood and poured it and brought it to her, not setting it on the table but handing it directly, which meant standing close, which meant she had to tip her chin up, and he was looking down and the cup moved between them like a small, entirely ordinary thing that was somehow not ordinary at all. She took it. Her fingers found his for one moment before he let go. The council session is at 10, he said. I have the morning free, she said. Then come with me, he said. After. She raised her eyebrows. Into the session? No, after. He went back to the desk, settled back into his work. There's the salt marsh on the eastern side of the territory. It's frozen over in winter. I've been told it's worth seeing. She held the coffee and watched him pretend to be absorbed in his papers. You've been told, she said. I looked it up, he said, without looking up. She smiled into her coffee. Outside the world was white and large and full of the ordinary business of winter and time. Through the window the sky was the particular pale blue that follows a heavy snow, limitless and clean. She reached out and set her hand on his desk. He looked at it. He set his hand over hers. The morning held them exactly like that, with everything still to come, and the whole unfinished world arranged itself patiently outside the window and waited.